Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start because we only get an hour with Michèle. It's a rare hour. It's an incredibly important hour. I am so delighted to have Michèle here today. Today's roundtable is part of a series of roundtables that we're holding that are really looking at the key foreign policy issues in the run-up to the U.S. 2020 elections. Obviously, this is absolutely fundamental and critical to what we're doing. It's been critical for a long time. And I think it's safe to say that this is the most important and consequential U.S. election in anybody's lifetime who's on this call, for sure. And it's difficult to imagine a better person to talk with us about U.S. foreign security and defense policy than Michèle Flournoy, who will be speaking on the record, which means that if you ask Michèle a question, you will be on the record. So just please be aware. It's wonderful. It's your moment. We are recording. We will post. We will share. It's your moment to ask a great question. The topic, of course, is U.S. global leadership post-COVID-19. I'll say just a word about Michèle because she is very well known to all of us. She has had a very long and distinguished career in national security and defense in the United States, perhaps very well known to us, not only for her work in government, but also as co-founder in 2007 of the Center for New American Security, when she also served as chief executive officer. In 2009, Michèle became U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She was in that role for 3 years, serving a Republican and a Democrat Secretary of Defense. And in this role, she was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations. Obviously, extraordinarily important moment. She is now co-founder and managing partner at West Exec Advisors. So I think it's safe to say that we have extraordinary expertise here with us today. I want to start, Michèle, by perhaps asking you a question. And I know you've been writing a lot over the last several years. You also had a piece in the Washington Post yesterday, which was fantastic for those of you who haven't seen it, that was really looking at what are the factors across countries that have led to the most successful responses to the spread of the coronavirus so far. But you have a long history working on security and defense. You must have strong views about the most important challenges and the direction of travel for U.S. security and defense policy. But I'm curious, in light of the current global pandemic and the crisis, both in health and economic and political and social terms that it's thrown up for all of us, how much of your views of America and its role in the world and where America should be heading in the days, weeks, months, and especially after November, how much of your views actually changed in light of the pandemic?
Well, first of all, Leslie, thank you for hosting me. Thanks, everybody, for joining this conversation. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I think this crisis has really deepened concerns that were already deepening about the sort of future trajectory of U.S. global leadership, of U.S. national security policy, in at least three main ways. First, I've always believed that we needed to take a broader view on what counts as national security. There are aspects of climate change that should count. Many of us who've worked on bioterrorism issue have also argued that pandemics should be in the framework. But from a perspective of senior leader bandwidth, focus and strategy, focus in terms of resourcing, that rarely has been the case and certainly has not been the case in this administration. I think President Obama's record is having tried to, take this, the pandemic threat more seriously. Come back to that point in a minute. But a lot of that work was sort of pretty systematically dismantled in the last few years. So the first thing is, I do think coming out of this, it will be a political imperative for any U.S. president to treat the health and safety of the American people as a national security issues, and that will include public health and pandemic preparedness going forward. The second thing is I wrote another piece recently with Lisa Monaco that ran in Politico, and we argued that we are at risk of having U.S. global leadership as one of the casualties of this crisis. If you look at global crises of the past or large major crises, whether it was, the AIDS crisis under President Bush, the financial crisis that went from Bush and then went into the Obama administration, or more recently, the Ebola outbreak. In all of those cases, the United States stepped up into a leadership role, leveraging the relevant institutions, be it G7, G20, WHO, WTO, et cetera, IMF, and sort of built a international coalition, orchestrated a more coherent response, and I think had more of a global positive impact in so doing. The fact that the United States has not played that role in this crisis is a real problem, and I think it's sort of confirmed the impression of many around the world, whether be they allies and partners or potential rivals, that the U.S. is not showing up on the world stage in the way that it has in the past. Now, I think one of the questions that'd be interesting to discuss is that recoverable? Could a new administration come in and sort of recover that posture and that position and that credibility? But I do think this crisis, I can't remember who said every, crisis is an opportunity that shouldn't be wasted, something along those lines. We did not take the opportunity to really step up and try to lead and bring the world together. And I think the biggest consequence of that, beyond our own leadership posture or stature, is in the developing world. We have not seen the worst of this virus yet, because it is now spreading to countries that have no public health infrastructure to speak up, or very little. They have, basic, PPE aside, they don't have access to clean water or soap or, the ability to social distance. So you're going to have a very lethal wave of this virus going through the poorest communities, the most vulnerable communities in the world. And I think that will likely be the source of the second wave coming back to the developed world. And I think some of that could have been addressed through a more decisive and aggressive international action. The last thing I'll just highlight, and we can go into this in more detail in the discussion, is the impact on U.S.-China relations. Obviously, we were not on a good trajectory before, but this crisis has made it worse, partly because both sides are struggling with the implications of this in terms of their own domestic political situations. I think the Xi leadership was very surprised and sort of put off balance by the strength of the pushback they received domestically because of the initial efforts to suppress and deny and so forth. They've also been, I think, surprised by the strength of the international reaction in terms of their not sharing data, not being accurate with the data they did share, not allowing international folks to come in and try on the public health side and try to assist. And so she is very sensitive about this issue right now. And I think when the Chinese, and so there he's, I don't want to overplay this. I don't think that the regime is at all in danger of collapse or at this point, but I do think they're in a very defensive, sensitive posture. And now you couple that with the domestic politics in the United States heading into an election season, and you have Trump trying to deflect attention from his own missteps, his own mishandling of the crisis early on, to sort of put all the blame on China. The China virus, the Wuhan virus, we don't want to fund the World Health Organization anymore because it's all, it's been commandeered by China and so forth. So that the anti-China rhetoric is starting to play into the domestic political campaigns here. and it's sort of empowering hardliners on both sides. So again, we can unpack that more, but I think those are the kind of big three things that are my concerns at the moment.
So let me ask you a question that kind of allows you to address all of those three, but a concrete issue that you clearly have a lot of experience on, which is, what does this mean for the Defense Department? Obviously, all of these issues are issues that need the expertise of people from across the U.S. government, multiple agencies. The interagency process is something that needs to be rehabilitated, I guess. At least this is what we hear, those of us who are watching America from outside of the United States. But, if you were thinking about, if you found yourself in an administration in January, and you're sort of looking at the movement of the Defense Department since the time you left, or since, the end of the Obama administration, perhaps, and you now have this context that I guess, we anticipated for a very long time. And even in 2004, the quadrennial report of the National Intelligence Council anticipated that in 2020, there would be a global pandemic, not wildly different from what we're seeing now. But, if you suddenly found yourself in that position and you had to rethink spending and rethink coordination and the distribution of resources, how do you do that? I mean, what would be the sort of starting point for that kind of work?
So I think in terms of impact on defense, a couple of things. One is right now, whenever you have a situation where the U.S. is internally preoccupied, that is a sort of invitation for rivals or potential adversaries to make mischief, to test the limits and boundaries. And we've frankly seen some of that from China in the South China Sea just in the last few weeks, vis-a-vis contested areas with Vietnam. And so I do think really focusing on deterrence right now and making sure that we're very clear about in communicating our own interests and what we will defend, not only the United States, but we alongside our allies and partners, and also making sure that we're present, that we're continuing to invest in the capabilities we'll need to make deterrence effective in the future. The second thing right now is the U.S. military is also dealing with this virus, and as we saw in the Teddy Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier, this is going to create some readiness issues. I think there have been some trainings, exercises, certain things that have been suspended until the virus peaks and as that peak has passed. So there are some readiness issues that I know the department is managing very carefully. I don't think it's catastrophic, but it is an extra pressure on the system, if you will. And then to your point, Leslie, I do think coming out of this, as we do think about national security more broadly, as we're coming out of this huge, coming out of this with an economy that needs recovery, institutions and workforces that need rebuilding, there are going to be a lot of competing demands on the discretionary part of the U.S. budget. And I think that the era of sort of unconstrained or largely, relatively unconstrained defense spending is going to be over. And I think the Defense Department is going to have to live with a more flat defense budget, and and that will force some harder choices within the program going forward.
So let me ask you one more question about this, and then I'm going to come to John Soares, who I know also has a question for you. I know because I asked him, and he said he did. And I guess it's about regional priorities. And, you worked in an administration that really tried to reorient America's focus towards Asia while dealing with some extraordinary complexity in the Middle East. That complexity has evolved. It hasn't gone away, and it won't go away. And it's perhaps changed as a result of the current pandemic. But, what is your thinking on that in terms of relative prioritization, or how the U.S. should differently manage its engagement in the Middle East in light of, an age-old desire, but also a global pandemic that's changing the contours of existing problems? I mean, I'm reminded of Richard Haas's piece, which I think some people agree with and some don't, which is that this is, the pandemic is accelerating history, as opposed to, transforming it. But I guess, what about the Middle East and the reorientation towards Asia?
Well, I don't think that we can afford to ignore any region. I think the rebalance to Asia was always put in relative terms. I still believe that the assessment that when you look at U.S. economic and security interests, the region that will offer both the greatest challenges and the greatest opportunities for the United States in the next 50 years will be Asia. That said, we can't ignore the Middle East. We have our most important allies in the world are in Europe, and we have to. So I think we have a lot of rebuilding to do with our allies and our partners. I think many of the challenges we face, including that with China, would be better dealt with if we were to build a sort of coalition of like-minded free market democracies, who all of whom have many of the same issues with China's unfair trading practices, with their restrictions on access to the market, with their stealing of intellectual property. We could. One of my biggest criticisms of the Trump administration's China policy is that it's been very bilateral, very tactical, and very transactional. And I think that's made us far less effective in dealing with China than if we were to come, with our partners in the EU, our allies in NATO and the EU, or with our key treaty allies and key partners in Asia to sort of to approach China together. Now, I know that's complicated. It's easier said than done. But I do think there's opportunity there. The other thing I would say is I think this administration, when it comes to the Middle East, this administration has sort of sees security threats in the very narrow space of U.S. military response. And when the president was unwilling to use force as Iran was escalating its provocations, the answer was, well, let's send 10,000 more troops. Let's send 20,000 more troops. Let's send, to me, that's not the most effective way you deter. First of all, you need to use the whole toolbox, economic. Okay, I'll give them credit. Maximum pressure campaign has been using sanctions to the nth degree. But there's very little diplomacy. There's very little broader strategy that's putting this all together. And I think you could have even used the military instrument more effectively in terms of establishing deterrence far before you got to the level of Americans being killed. So this is all means we're going to have a lot of hard choices. There's going to be very tough trade-offs. When you don't end up, you have more strategic demand than you have resources, you end up in situations where you have to manage risk. And that's going to be a lot of the sort of enduring theme of this. We have more risks, and we're going to have more constrained, or at least resources where there's greater competition for the resources we do have. And that's going to force harder choices. But I think also, in the end, better policy, because I think we can't do everything unilaterally. We can't do everything militarily. And we can't just keep spending as if debt and deficit don't matter. So it's going to force us to be more strategic and prioritized, I think, going forward, if we have the right leadership. I'm going to try not to be too partisan in this discussion, but if we don't have a change in November, I think the future for U.S. leadership and U.S. strategy is going to be very bleak.
I mean, I should give you the opportunity to be as analytical in your partisanship as you'd like to. I don't think there's any reason to hold back. Quite seriously, we're here to host really tough exchange, so we would love to hear your views on all of this. So please don't feel like you have to hold back because it's Chatham House. We maybe sometimes do, but you definitely don't. Okay. Sir John Soros, if you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, and then I know you had a question for Michèle.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and thanks, Michèle, for joining us today. You know who I am, and we've known each other for 25 years. So, but I'm now running my own advisory firm like you are. And before that, I was chief of MI6 and ambassador at the UN and did various other jobs. I think if there's a change of leadership in the United States this November, your allies in Europe are going to breathe a huge sigh of relief. including those who are sort of nominally trying to work closely with Trump and trying to manage the Trump administration, as of course we're condemned to do. And I think many of the sentiments you're expressing will be shared by people here. I mean, our sense of when US leadership works best is when the US engages with partners and allies. Ebola is a good example. Britain and France were as involved in the Ebola crisis as the United States was. In the 2008 financial crash, Gordon Brown was chairing the G20 and worked closely with Hu Jintao and with Barack Obama to get the outcome that we did. And the United States has worked on Asian crises closely with Japan and South Korea. So it's that willingness to engage with allies and to use the architecture of the international system, which has been a key to successful US leadership. I was quite shocked at the Munich Security Conference just 2 months ago to hear Nancy Pelosi basically pursuing, as a Democrat, most senior Democrat in Washington, pursuing exactly the same line on China as representatives of the current administration. I think if we can't wind the clock back to 2016. Everyone's quoting Heraclitus at the moment. You can't go down to the same river twice. The world has moved on, the river has moved on, and things are different. But I wonder if those differences don't extend to the Democratic Party in the US as well, and that we'll find Democrats in a much more confrontational mindset with China than your European partners and your Asian partners and allies, who share, as you say, many of the same fundamental concerns about China, but do not want to have a new Cold War, do not see China as an enemy, don't want to treat China as an enemy. But some of the language coming out of Democrats in the US is quite sort of binary and hostile and anti-China. So where do you think the mood on the Democratic side in the US is likely to evolve, and will you be able to reforge those alliances that you all want, but can't be unconditional? We all want America to take a lead. None of us want America to tell us to just fall in line and do what we're told, which has been the history of the last 3.5 years. So how can we find that balance? Are the Democrats really willing to do that, or has the river moved on so far that actually that network of alliances and international organizations is no longer within reach?
Michèle, can you add to that also your evaluation of the business community across America and where its interests are in China?
So I don't think we're beyond valuing alliances. I think if you look at Vice President Biden and the people he would likely surround himself with, they are strong believers that our greatest strategic advantage in the world is our unparalleled global network of alliances. And that to manage alliances well, it's not, calling up your counterparts and telling them what to do. It is engaging deeply to come up with, understanding mutual concerns, understanding differences where you have them, but then coming up with some shared way forward and some division of labor, frankly, as you described. Other countries have been absolutely critical, and the leadership on many of these issues has been shared. I don't want to speak for Nancy Pelosi, but I'm guessing, right now what I can say is, we're in an election period. And if you were to look at US-China rhetoric over time, in the 6 months before an election or the year before an election, it always gets much more hawkish on both sides. You've got President Trump running campaign, or a PAC supporting him, running campaign ads about Beijing Joe or Beijing Biden, attacking Biden for being too soft on China. So there is a domestic political element that now's the time for everybody to step up and be tough on China. But I think from more fundamentally, there was a shift in around 2014, even in the second Obama term, where, I think as she sort of moved from a hide and bide policy, don't worry about us, we're just a developing country, worried about bringing our own population out of poverty, don't worry about us on the world stage, we're going to be rule abiding. We had everybody trying to work to make China a responsible stakeholder, as Bob Zoellick used to call it, and this was across Republican and Democratic administrations. what happened in 2014 is the mask came off, the veil was lifted, and Xi started being much more assertive and aggressive. He started breaking promises that he had personally made to President Obama. And so I think across the American political spectrum, you have this moment of reassessment of, this is a much more muscular, ambitious China. Where I think there really is a difference on the side is how to deal with that. I think on the Democratic side, and again, I'm not going to speak for Vice President Biden, but my sense is on the Democratic side, the first principle is we approach China with and through our allies and partners. Number two, the most important thing we can do to compete with China economically and technologically is to invest in the drivers of American competitiveness here at home. And that's even more true after the economic impacts of this crisis. Science and technology, research and development, 21st infrastructure. Why in the world is the US not a leader on 5G at this moment? I mean, that's just unforgivable and inexplicable. It actually is explainable, but it needs to be addressed. Quantum computing, AI, there's so many other areas. And that's where our competitive, our ability to compete well is going to come first and foremost from how we invest at home. This also relates to smart immigration policy, smart education policy, and so forth. But then in terms of how we approach China more broadly, again, I think there's a differentiated approach. I think Democrats understand this is a nuclear power. The name of the game is not to win a war with China. The name of the game is to prevent a war with China. And to do it through a deterrence, either through deterrence by denial, having the whole of government ability to prevent them from a rapid seizure of Taiwan, for example, or deterrence by cost imposition, to have them very clearly understand our capability to impose substantial costs, and it makes them decide, well, I guess I won't invade Taiwan today. So that is, I just think it's a fundamentally different strategy. But I do worry that the rhetoric in the campaign season will get very, very hot. I think, I'm hopeful, though, if we had a change of administration, that you'd have a very strategic approach. And the last thing I'll say on that is people understand that however competitive and tense the relationship gets, there are issues like pandemics, like climate change, like nonproliferation, like North Korea, that you cannot solve without China at the table. And we need to be able to have a productive working relationship in those areas and try to find and build on our common interests where they exist. In terms of the business community, I actually think in general, they are a voice of moderation on this issue. They are part of very, very integrated and interdependent global supply chains. They, on the one hand, want to see more structural change in China to create a more level playing field. But on the other hand, they really suffer greatly when there's any kind of trade wars. And now even in some far right quarters of the Congress, there's talk about potentially sanctioning China over the pandemic. So the business community, I mean, it's not monolithic. They don't necessarily have one voice, but in general, I think they've been a voice of reason, sort of moderating some of the hardliners in the Trump White House. I do think we are going to see a diversification of supply chains away from China in some key areas now, including pharma, medical, and protective equipment, because again, I think that for Americans to go through this crisis once without having reliable sources of supply, I just think it's going to be more like defense industry, where people become very concerned about any overdependence or vulnerability, linked back to counting on a Chinese supply chain.
Great. Simon Fraser. And again, I should remind everybody that we are on the record, and it's really wonderful if you can introduce yourselves. Michèle knows you, but not everybody on the call will know your background.
Hello, Leslie. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted? Yeah. Hi. Hello, Michèle. Simon Fraser here.
See you.
Very good to see you. So I'm the Deputy Chairman of Chatham House these days, and of course was the Permanent Secretary in the Foreign Office during the coalition government. I mean, I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question, or possibly two quick questions. The comment is, you said in your opening remarks that the US is not showing up. And I have to say, I've had the impression that the UK hasn't shown up in terms of the international response. I mean, my own impression of the UK response has been incredibly nationally focused, rather slow and a bit erratic. And we haven't really projected very much internationally. And I suppose, that's not surprising in the short term because it's a crisis, but it sort of brings home to me this broader question of where the UK is going to be and how it's going to leverage international influence, to use your words again, in the future after Brexit. So that's just an observation that I've had on our position. But the question I wanted to ask you was on your second theme, which I think is a really important one, which is about the developing world. Because I think this is really interesting, and I think it hasn't been sufficiently examined or studied so far. Obviously, the impact of this virus potentially in Africa, for example, where there are populations weakened by HIV, could be dramatic. But on the other hand, they're younger populations. So I don't know whether the morbidity rates, for example, might be different there. I think. So my question there was, are you aware of, and could you share with us, if you are, of any serious sort of study or really interesting analysis that's gone on of the impact in the developing world? And the other thing I've noticed relating to that is there's been a lot of expression of concern, not only amongst the poorest countries, but amongst the middle-income countries in Latin America, for example, about the impact, and particularly economic impact, that it's going to have on them. So this is not only a health crisis, it's an ongoing economic crisis as well. I think these are really interesting issues which have not had sufficient focus so far.
Yeah. Simon, I'm not aware of any definitive study yet on the developing world. And I take your point, the youth of the population may be a saving grace. But, Mike Morrell, former acting head of the CIA, and I did this short piece for the Washington Post on what are the factors determining the difference between countries that seem to be weathering this crisis relatively well and those that are not. And we came up with 6, and I think they're relevant here. One was the state of the public health system. In the developing world, that's going to be pretty weak. Second is the overall health of the population, and we focused on things like obesity and heart disease and so forth. But you could also look at other factors like, suppressed immune or damaged immune systems because of AIDS or other things. The third was culture and social cohesion. Countries like, part of the we took South Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand as examples where you have the social cohesion and culture for different reasons, but the people actually are more compliant with government direction and so forth. That's going to vary hugely in the developing world. Early decisive action by the government, again, not as likely in many of these weaker places where just day-to-day governments are having trouble meeting the basic needs of their populations. They may not be in a position to do the right things early in a pandemic. Fourth was a whole of country approach as opposed to regional approaches. You compare Germany and Italy, for example, and that contrast is clear. And then last is just quality of leadership. When you have someone like the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who I think, sort of found her not found, but displayed her leadership after the Christchurch shootings, coming into this crisis with that empathetic, truth-telling, clear, strong leadership voice, has done a lot in terms of ensuring compliance with a total national shutdown, and that has served them very well. So I list those only to say I think a lot of those factors are absent in the developing world, and add to that, I'm on the board of CARE, and we're basically repurposing our network and our infrastructure in 97 countries right now to focus on COVID prevention and response. And it's really basic, like access to clean water and soap. the ability to social distance in slum areas or what have you. Just basic education about the pandemic and how to prevent it. PPE. I mean, all of this is just even so much worse in many of these countries than what we're experiencing, and we know how bad it's been here. So that's I think what underlies my pessimism. I do hope that we will take some lessons from this, and that those lessons will also be applied to investing in development as well, longer term.
Okay, we're going to open it up more widely. We already have Philip Stevens and Lindsay Newman on the list, but just to remind everybody that we are on the record. And again, if you can tell us your affiliation, I'll continue to take them one at a time because it's so nice to get the answers in this format. But Philip Stevens, if you'd like to go ahead and go next. You've got to unmute yourself, Philip. Okay, we're going to go to Lindsay Newman.
Philip Stevens.
Oh, there we go. Good. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Philip Stevens from the FT. I have two questions. The first is about the Middle East. I remember a conversation in 2016 with someone quite senior in the Obama administration, and we were talking about Syria and Iraq. And this person just turned to me and said, look, America has had it with the Middle East. We've just had it. This is not, just about this administration. This is the end of a sort of 70-year-old story of America in the Middle East. And it certainly looked like that with the present administration, even allowing for the strangeness and eccentricities of the Trump administration. And I just wonder whether you think that's true. And the second thing is a sneaky question. What would a new administration most want from its European allies?
Great question.
Yeah. So on the Middle East, I do think particularly on the far right and the far left of our political spectrum, you have elements who have a more isolationist view and are pretty frustrated and done with the Middle East. And I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the fatigue and the frustration associated with those efforts have certainly created greater caution with regard to military engagement in the Middle East. But I think if you look at the middle of the spectrum across both parties, the region gets a vote. And we can't necessarily, we ignore whole regions of the world and their problems at our peril, because if you allow those problems to fester for too long, they often come out and touch you where it hurts, either your citizens abroad, your interests abroad, or you're even at home. So I think it's really a question of, in relative terms, how do we do what we need to do in the Middle East with our allies and partners to protect ourselves, but in relative terms, free up resources and bandwidths relative to the last 20 years, where that was so much the focus, to attend to other more strategic interests or, more globally. So, I don't deny that is a sentiment that is sometimes expressed by people. I just think when it comes to actually being a practitioner in national security, ignoring the Middle East is not a good recipe for protecting American interests, if you were to take that approach literally. And I think, frankly, the rapid withdrawal, from the way in which the withdrawal from Iraq was handled was, a cautionary tale. I think, other experiences underscore that, recognizing that, the position has changed. I think the terrorism threat is in a different place. I think America's energy position is different, although obviously we're experiencing right now, we care a whole lot about the price of oil on the world market. So But anyway, I think ignoring the Middle East is a dangerous proposition, even as I would argue to shift, to do it at less cost, if you will, going forward. To engage in a smarter, less costly manner in the future. In terms of what we need and want from our allies, I think we need to kind of go back to first principles together and to sit down and talk about what values do we share, what interests do we share, how, where are we aligned, where do we have differences that we need to manage, and how do we most effectively pool our efforts and our resources to tackle some of these really hard problems, or at least manage them and manage the risks associated with them. There's in almost every case you can name, whether it's, a transnational challenge like, a pandemic or climate change, or a difficult regional challenge like Iran or North Korea, the United States alone is not, no matter how powerful and how effective, is not going to solve these things alone. We may not solve them together, but at least we can certainly manage them much more effectively and reduce the risk if we're on the same page and we're working together, each bringing strengths to the table. So, this is a back to basics, back to first principles kind of effort that is needed in my view. And what gives me hope is that I have actually seen it work. I was fortunate to be part of an administration where when a crisis would come up, we would actually sit down with our allies and work towards common solutions, a kind of common playbook, a division of labor, constant consultation, communication to stay on the same page. It can be done. And so that's my one note of optimism. I don't want to be too depressing in this hour. So that's my note of optimism. It can be done.
Thank you. Lindsay Newman.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Michelle, so much. This has been fantastic. Lindsay Newman, Dr. Lindsay Newman, Senior Research Fellow with the U.S. and Americas Program at Chatham House. I really take your point that sort of while the U.S. is focused inwards, others will create mischief. And my question ties into what Sir Simon was saying earlier around the impacts on the developing world, which you paint a very chilling picture. I just wonder, in addition to the potential for a second wave of the coronavirus back in the developed world and then elsewhere in the developing world, again, a sort of constant cycle, I wonder if it also might put, as it hits the developing world, if it might also put on the table an emerging set of national security challenges. I'm thinking, a number of these countries are already quite vulnerable. We've got Venezuela, Libya, Syria, just to name a few. And could we see new insurgent groups, a sort of West versus West mindsets, terrorist groups emerging, especially, as I said, as some of these are so-called failed states or failing states. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that, the more failed states that we have, the more you have, the greater the ungoverned spaces, expand. And those are kind of petri dishes for insurgent groups, terrorist groups, and others. So I do worry about that. I also worry about the economic dimension of this. I mean, I'm not an economist, but you will have great increase in indebtedness. You may have economic collapse in some of these countries. And you may also, that also creates opportunity. We've already seen China's, what I call their PPE diplomacy, arrive with a plane load of, masks and medical gear and a check and make a new best friend. And I think the more vulnerable the country is, the more open to that kind of effort. And on the one hand, if it were sort of no strings attached assistance, that would be wonderful. That would be China stepping up. But unfortunately, we've seen in too many cases, even prior to this crisis, that the strings attached can be quite draconian for the receiving country.
It's such a shame for Oxford that the letters PPE will never, ever be thought of.
Yeah, politics, philosophy, and economics. That's what I thought when I first heard it. It's a repurposing of the acronym. different.
Jeremy Shapiro is next.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm Jeremy Shapiro I'm the research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I think it was tougher on the people who had the ISIS acronym than the people who had the PPP acronym, but I take your point. I guess I had a comment and a question. I think first, just to put Michèle's answer to Philip Stevens a little bit more sharply, I think that what a new U.S. administration is going to want out of its allies is a demonstration that this new approach actually works in getting greater cooperation from allies, particularly on the issue of China. And while going back to first principles is certainly useful and would be good, I think that actually more practically the new administration is going to want to be demonstrating that having an allied approach works. I think Michèle describes very well the Obama administration's approach, and I certainly favor it. Wasn't always successful. And I think that it needs to be seen as successful if it's going to continue. And that sort of leads into my question, which is, like Michèle, I would really welcome a Biden administration. And I think like John Sawyers, I definitely agree that the Europeans would welcome it too. But when they look at the last few years, they see a real commitment problem for the United States that really inheres at this point in U.S. governance, this idea that that the U.S. can pull out of treaties that a previous administration, I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise here. The idea that the U.S. can pull out of treaties that a previous administration adhered to, like TPP, like the JCPOA, like the climate change treaty. And it seems to me that Europeans who have their own domestic politics will be quite focused on the fact that making commitments with the United States when another administration might come in 4 years later and completely undo them is going to be something that they're going to be very chary of. And so I'm wondering what a new administration needs to do to create a greater domestic consensus around these types of policies so that partners and allies can have a greater sense that this will continue into another administration. Mm-hmm. And related to that, maybe how does the concept of global leadership need to change to create that domestic consensus?
Okay, let me try to remember all of those. I totally agree with you that, while you're having the back to basics conversation, you need to create momentum with some early wins. One of the things I learned at my time at Boston Consulting Group is when you have a very long transformation plan, you've got to create momentum with some early signs of progress and gains. And I think, frankly, when I was part of the transition team that didn't have a chance to come in last time, we had a first 100 days plan with a lot of those things on the list. And I think if I were, again, not speaking for any campaign or anybody else, but I think one of the first signals the U.S. should be sending, and a Biden administration should be, hey, we actually see the value of treaties. We see the value of joining together to solve problems. And the first thing I would expect to see is a U.S. recommitment to the Paris Accords, and then a call to go beyond the Paris Accords on climate change. I think on a bilateral basis, you'll have immediately on a new president's desk the whole question of whether to extend the New START treaty with Russia. I think showing that we're going to stay in the arms control game, that we value nuclear stability and predictability, even as other elements that affect strategic stability are changing, that would be an important sense. So I do take your point. I think part of the transition team's job will be to come up with what are those critical signals we want to send in those first 100 days. I remember even in the Obama transition, wanting, the effort to signal the growing importance of Asia in Obama's strategic calculus. It determined very tactical things like where would be, what was Hillary Clinton's first visit as Secretary of State? Who did Obama invite to the White House for this first state dinner? All of those were Asian, leaders. So I think, so I'm just saying, I absolutely agree with your point, and some of those early wins will be very important to demonstrate, hey, there's a new sheriff in town. This is a new way of working. I don't think we can just dial go back, because the world has changed a lot. And I do think it's going to be incredibly challenging. I mean, I wrote a piece, my first piece with Kurt Campbell at CNAS was called The Inheritance, talking about how challenging what Obama, what we didn't know who it was going to be then, but the president in 2009, how challenging that would be. Now, it's even more so, because we're going to be in the midst of a huge economic recovery, hopefully, and also all of the rebuilding challenges that we're talking about here. And Jeremy, I'm sorry, I think I forgot your last thing. What was your last question?
It was about the idea of a greater domestic consensus for foreign policy, so they can have a sense of U.S. commitment.
Yeah. So actually, if you look at polling across America, Americans are very supportive of U.S. engagement, which writ large, and particularly engagement alongside our allies and partners. They understand the strategic value of not going alone, but going together with our allies. Where there is greater hesitation is, over military intervention, particularly large-scale, long-duration regime change operations. But I don't think we should. It's not a questioning all U.S. engagement. It is really greatest concern there. The second thing is in economic terms. I think there's been a lot of structural change and some labor dislocation because of globalization. I think you've had even more because of automation, but most of the blame is put on globalization. And so there is a greater skepticism about, free trade agreements and so forth. But I think that, if you accompany if you make the case appropriately and well, and you accompany those free trade agreements with domestic investment to deal with some of the changes that may be wrought, I think it's still possible. But I think it has to be a very strategic conversation with the American people to say, what do we mean by U.S. global leadership in the world, and what does that really require? And oh, by the way, what happens when it doesn't happen? And how much worse off are we then?
Okay, Jeremy, very sneaky of you to get 3 questions in one. Classic Jeremy Shapiro. So we have 4 people on the list. I'm actually, because I happen to know, having Googled Michèle Flournoy quite extensively over the weekend, that you have another talk to give yet today. So we're going to keep to time. I'm going to take the last 4 questions, knowing that you won't be able to answer all of them, but I will take them all because it's good to hear from people. It'll give you a sense of what our audience is most concerned with. And I'll also add mine, which is that I'd be very curious to know that if you were currently advising a U.S. president about how to use the Defense Production Act, what you would have told him to do in this current crisis beyond what's happening now. But can we hear from Ian Bond, Alex Wilson, Peter Watkins, Ron Freeman? Really succinct question, because Michèle does have another very important talk to give today. So Ian, if you want to go first.
Yeah, hi. Yes, I'm Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. Quick question about Russia. I mean, Russia has done a remarkable job of getting a lot of Republicans particularly to think that Russia is more on their side than some of their European allies. Is that just a transient phenomenon that will disappear with Trump and those around him, or is there a more fundamental change in thinking in the Republican Party about the relationship with Russia and with, sort of, if I can put it this way, forces of global conservatism?
And Alex Wilson?
Thank you very much. Yes, Michèle, Alex Wilson, British Army Strategic Analysis. Just looking forward to the US election. You said you were worried on 3 fronts, but it strikes me that the worries that you have may not be shared by the Republican base, i.e. the impact on US-China relations, the risk of having the US global leadership as one of the casualties of the crisis, and even the national security must be broader. So how do you really see this panning out in the election, given that some of those issues that you have, I'm not sure might apply to the Republican base?
Mm-hmm.
Peter Watkins.
So Michelle, Peter Watkins, formerly Policy Director in the Ministry of Defence. Two very quick questions. One is, you mentioned deterrence. We think of deterrence more in a European context, and there is an argument that the rather disjointed European response to the disease will be seen as showing a lack of cohesion which could weaken deterrence. So how would you bolster deterrence in those circumstances? And secondly, given the lack of leadership that's been mentioned and the fundamental issues that this crisis raises for middle powers, do you see this as being potentially an opportunity for the middle powers? I'm thinking of the UK, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, etc. And should the US actively support that?
And then Ron Freeman and Daniela Schwartzer. Ron, if you want to go first.
Thank you, Leslie. When President Biden takes his seat in the Oval Office in January, which he will do, and I'll tell you in a moment why, he's going to find that the federal government has spent the last year of the Trump administration $4 trillion more than it's taken in revenues, against the backdrop of a over-indebted Fed balance sheet, over-indebted private sector, with even Exxon drawing down its the limit of its bank lines. What does he do about that, given the huge need for catch-up investment in the United States? And the reason why I think Vice President Biden is going to win is because the gods of history will be on our side. There's only been twice in the history of the Republic that we've had 3 two-term presidents in a row. The last 3, and numbers 3, 4, and 5, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Trump has already had too many exceptions in his life. He's not going to get this one.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And finally, Daniela Schwartzer.
Thank you for adding me to the list, Leslie. Daniela Schwartzer, I'm the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Very quickly, I would like to know, Michelle, what your working hypothesis would be on the future of the European Union. And when we go back to the question on what would the next US administration expect from its allies, I mean, the jury is out whether Europe will be able to respond to the current crisis in a more unified way. And one of the issues that will be coming up also on our side is defense spending. As you mentioned this for the US, we will be facing very much the same discussions and are already engaging in them now. And the question is whether you think that a democratic US administration would be fully supportive if Europe went ahead with more common defense expenditure, strengthening its own armament industry, and so on and so on. Those ideas which have been around for a while. This crisis could actually accelerate them. Trump has framed this very much as a competition between Europe and the US within NATO. How would you think the next administration would be thinking about this development?
Yeah. So Michelle, whatever you think you would like to take on, I know that's more than you probably have time for, but we're grateful.
Lightning round. I think on the Defense Production Act, Leslie, I think the key thing would have been to use it much earlier, like in January. It takes time for these things for factories to get reoriented, for production to start, for things to start coming off the line. And had we started earlier and more seriously, I think we would be in a much better position in terms of supplies for our hospitals today. So I think the Act provides all the authorities that we need. It just wasn't used well or early. To Ian's question about Russia, it is a really strange view that sort of started in this administration, maybe a little before, that if we have the dual threats of Russia and China, we've got to pick one to be a friend and one to be a foe, and Russia's going to be our friend. I don't think that, that has widespread traction in the Republican Party. I think it's kind of a set of Republicans who've come in behind the administration. If you look at the more traditional Republicans like a Mitt Romney, very different perspective. You look more broadly across the political spectrum, I think people understand the depth of Russian interference in our last elections, the constant cyber attacks, the constant mischief making in Europe and on its periphery. So, I don't think we're in danger of that particular view, although it exists in some quarters. I don't think it will become a widespread or dominant view in my assessment. On to Alex's point that, the Trump base doesn't share my concerns, I'd say two things. You're right. But the good news is that that base is, in the mid 40%. And American elections are not won or lost on national security or foreign policy issues. What I can say is Americans do care about the character and qualities of their commander-in-chief. And I think between his handling of this pandemic and some of his more unpredictable, focused on his own interests, rash and, just surprising and whipsawing decisions, I think Trump has lost the confidence not only among his critics, who he may never have had it, but among some of his initial supporters about his handling of the commander-in-chief role. So I do think national security will play in that sense, but not in the sort of issue-by-issue sense that I've been talking about, except possibly, who's tough on China. Peter, to your point about lack of EU cohesion, I think the United States has always had a positive, strong interest in seeing a united Europe, and we have an interest in seeing Europe come out of this stronger. But I do think, it's an open question, not one that the U.S. will have much influence in deciding, but I do think that whether, it's recovering some of that unity or whether it's because of the absence of that unity, I think the middle powers, as you call, I think the UK, France, Germany, others will have an important role to play. And we've seen, frankly, in many previous crises, having allies step up, whether it's collectively or individually, has been invaluable. So, I would think that would be the view in the future as well. As to, it relates to Daniela's question about defense, I think the main issue for Democratic and Republican administrations has always been, we want, our NATO allies to do their part. Secretary Gates's last speech before he departed was, we need you to step up and do more. I would just say my personal view is it's not just one metric. It's not just the metric of defense spending. It's how do you contribute overall to shared national security or international security concerns. It's how much do you share risk alongside us? I was personally offended at some of the rhetoric that was used vis-a-vis Germany, frankly, when German soldiers showed up in Afghanistan, fought and died alongside their American counterparts. That should count for something. It's not just how big is the check, right? The one place I think that makes everybody nervous is when that strong European defense rhetoric turns protectionist, meaning, our industry alone, U.S. industry out, there'll be no sharing of capabilities across the transatlantic. I think that's where you'd find a strong objection if it went in that direction. And then, Ron, I think you have put your finger on the biggest challenge. I am not an economist. I do think that deficits and debt will be a huge problem for all of us. I think that will motivate some changes in U.S. tax policy. It may eventually motivate some reforms to non-discretionary spending. But, these holes that we dig are done, they're dug in months or years, and they usually take decades to dig out of. So I don't think it's a one administration project. I think the next administration will have to start putting smarter policies in place and starting to address these issues, but it certainly won't be done in 4 years, not given the magnitude of the problem.
Michèle, that was really a tour de force. Extraordinary number of questions, often coming under the guise of one and getting 3 or 4 even in one go. But you've really covered the range, and I think given us a lot to look forward to, a lot of hope, As you know, because you spend a lot of time speaking to Europeans, I think that the mood towards America at the moment is quite dismal. And I think people want to believe that America is going to come back and go back to first principle with its European partners. So you've given us a lot to think about. I will remind everybody that this was on the record. We have recorded, and to answer somebody's Q&A, we will be sharing it. Just thank you so much for taking the time. I hope that you will engage with us frequently at Chatham House in the years to come, and the months and years to come.
Well, thank you so much.
Everybody would like to
it's wonderful to see you all, and please stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Michèle, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michèle.